May 30th, 1968. Mead, Colorado. After leaving a party being held at his fiancee's residence, 18-year-old Leroy Drieth is killed when his car crashes into a tree, and his death is ruled to be a suicide. Decades later, Leroy's sister hears some incriminating stories about an altercation which supposedly took place at the party between Leroy and some of Patty's family members. After Leroy's body is exhumed, an autopsy uncovers a pair of knife wounds on his neck, and while his cause of death is officially changed to undetermined, there's still no conclusive answers about how Leroy was killed. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be exploring two separate cases involving suspicious deaths which were featured on Unsolved Mysteries: the 1968 death of Leroy Drieth and the 1992 death of Shelly Malone. Of course, since these deaths took place 25 years apart in different states, there is no connection between them, but I decided to profile them together on the same episode since there are numerous similarities. Both of these cases involved the victim dying in what was initially ruled to be a tragic accident, but their loved ones felt there were enough suspicious discrepancies to make them believe that foul play had taken place and there was an organized conspiracy involving multiple people to cover up what happened. Leroy Drieth's death took place after he attended a party at his fiancee's house and crashed his car into a tree, and since he supposedly made remarks about wanting to kill himself before he left, the deputy coroner actually ruled that the crash was an intentional act of auto-suicide. But as the years went on, a lot of stories would come out about an alleged altercation which took place at this party, and a new autopsy would uncover a pair of wounds on Leroy's neck to suggest he was violently attacked before his fatal crash took place. In Shelly Malone's case, she was killed while out horseback riding with one of her female friends, who claimed that after Shelly's horse was spooked and threw her to the ground, the animal proceeded to kick her and stomp her chest so hard that it ruptured her heart. Needless to say, this was quite an unusual way to die, and after witnessing some suspicious behavior from Shelly's boyfriend and her friends, her family became convinced that Shelly was murdered, and this so-called attack from her horse was staged to cover up what really happened to her. So on this episode, I'm going to start off by sharing Leroy's story before I discuss my theories and analysis, and then I'll move on to Shelly's case. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has around 70 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives, which are not available on our regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now start off by exploring the unexplained death of Leroy Drieth. Our first story begins in Colorado in 1968, and our first victim is 18-year-old Leroy Drieth. Leroy currently lives in the town of Platteville and is the oldest of 4 children to parents Henry and Frida Drieth, as he has 2 brothers named John and Doug, as well as a sister named Vicky. He is also engaged to his 17-year-old fiancée Patty, whom he has been in a relationship with for 1 year. Patty's surname has never been released publicly, but on May the 30th, Leroy attended a party at her family's residence in Mead, a small town located in Weld County. What actually happened at the party has never been conclusively established, but what we do know is that at some point during the late afternoon, Leroy left the party in his Chevrolet Impala and traveled less than 2 blocks before he arrived at a stop sign at a county road. But Leon went right through the stop sign and spiraled off the road before he wound up crashing head-on into a tree at Mead High School, leaving 69 feet worth of skin marks behind him. It's unclear how they found out about it, but the first people to arrive at the scene were Leroy's father, Henry, and his brother, Doug. Even though Leroy was seriously injured, he was still alive and semi-conscious, so while Henry checked his body, Doug went to a nearby grocery store in order to call an ambulance. By the time the paramedics arrived, a crowd had gathered at the scene, and when the ambulance driver, Delbert Mickelson, asked what happened, one of the witnesses told him that Leroy had a fight with his girlfriend and exclaimed he was going to kill himself before he drove off and crashed into the tree. Leroy was taken to a hospital in Longmont, located in adjacent Boulder County, but was pronounced dead shortly after he arrived. The Boulder County Deputy Coroner, George Howe Jr., soon arrived at the hospital, and when he asked what happened, Delbert Mickelson shared the account from the witness, who claimed that Leroy had been in a fight with his girlfriend and said he would kill himself. Well, believe it or not, Howe seemed to accept this story at face value, as he apparently made no attempt to corroborate it and decided that no autopsy was necessary. Howe concluded that Leroy's fight with his girlfriend had made him so distraught that he decided to intentionally crash his car into a tree, so the cause of death listed on Leroy's death certificate was auto-suicide. Well, needless to say, Leroy's family did not agree with this ruling and had a hard time believing that he would have taken his own life. Leroy's mother, Frida, contacted the Weld County District Attorney in Greeley to try and convince him to reopen the investigation into Leroy's death, but he rudely rejected her request and told her, quote, "You're just a distraught parent. There's no reason for us to investigate this. You just go on home and get over it," end quote. For the next 2 decades, the Drieth family felt powerless to do anything, as they rarely ever spoke of Leroy's death and put all of his photographs away. However, by the 20th anniversary of the event, Leroy's now married sister, Vicki Marling, who was only 11 years old when he died, decided to delve further into what happened. Vicki paid a visit to the Boulder County Coroner's office and was surprised when their current coroner acknowledged that he did not believe Leroy's death was properly investigated. He informed her that Leroy's death was one of only 3 recorded auto-suicide cases in the history of Colorado, but the other 2 cases had been thoroughly investigated for 6 months before the suicide ruling was reached. By contrast, there did not appear to be any investigation at all into Leroy's death, as the only existing documentation was a single 1-page form completed by the former Deputy Coroner, George Howe Jr., and the original Colorado State Patrol accident report could no longer be found. It seemed apparent that Howe had not personally interviewed anyone, took any photographs, or even visited the accident scene, as the auto-suicide ruling was based entirely on secondhand information which had been shared with him by state troopers and paramedics. The coroner recommended that Vicki hire a private investigator, but since she could not afford one, Vicki decided to perform her own independent investigation. This involved contacting and questioning people who had been neighbors of Patty's family at the time of Leroy's death, and they shared a much different version of events than the one from the official report. Instead of Leroy getting into a fight with Patty and declaring that he was going to kill himself, these witnesses now claimed that Leroy had actually gotten into an altercation with some of Patty's family members at the party. These relatives had been drinking and supposedly told Leroy that they did not like him being engaged to Patty due to the fact that he was white and she was Hispanic. Vicki eventually decided to place an advertisement in the newspaper asking Patty to contact her, and Patty soon came forward and had a one-on-one meeting. When asked about the allegations that Leroy said he was going to kill himself, Patty denied that he had ever said that. However, when Vicki pressed Patty for more information about what did happen, she did not want to talk about it. In August of 1993, Leroy's parents gave Vicki their blessing to have his body exhumed so that an autopsy could finally be performed. After the exhumation took place, it turned out that Leroy's body was in remarkably good condition after 25 years, and his autopsy would be conducted by forensic pathologist and Leroy County coroner Dr. Patrick Allen. Dr. Allen discovered 2 knife wounds on Leroy's neck, one of which was a 2-inch stab wound, and the other a curving 4-inch slash that had severed his trachea. The slash had been sewn shut by an embalmer, but as someone who performed autopsies on numerous accident victims, Dr. Allen did not believe this type of wound was ordinarily caused by car crashes. Curiously, the original death certificate said that Leroy's carotid arteries had been severed in the crash, but it turned out they were actually undamaged. While Dr. Allen concluded that the injuries Leroy sustained to his head, neck, and chest during the crash were what ultimately caused his death, he believed that the wounds on Leroy's neck indicated that he had been attacked beforehand. He wrote in his report, quote, "This wound may not have been immediately fatal, but was a very serious, potentially fatal wound. It is possible that the decedent may have been fleeing in his vehicle when the crash took place as a result of loss of control or loss of consciousness." End quote. Allen called for the case to be reopened and reclassified as probable foul play, and Weld County authorities finally agreed to launch a criminal investigation. The Boulder County coroner also changed the cause of death on Leroy's death certificate from auto-suicide to undetermined. Vicky later spoke to a woman named Carolyn Wirtz, who was Patty's former sister-in-law. Back in 1968, Carolyn had been married to Patty's brother and lived at their family's residence in the months before and after Leroy's death. Carolyn was able to provide a first-hand account of what happened at Patty's party and confirmed that after Leroy showed up there at around 5 p.m., one of Patty's relatives started a racially motivated argument with him, expressing his dissatisfaction over the fact that Patty was engaged to be married to a white man. Carolyn said that shortly after this altercation took place, Patty escorted Leroy outside to his car, and this was the last time Carolyn ever saw him. However, Vicky became convinced that before Leroy drove away, one of Patty's relatives may have attacked him with a knife by stabbing him in the neck and slashing his windpipe. Since these wounds did not immediately kill Leroy, he climbed into his car and attempted to flee the scene, but soon lost consciousness and crashed head-on into a tree 2 blocks from the house. Leroy's story would receive national exposure when it was featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, which aired in January of 1996, and sometime after it aired, Vicky claimed that she was contacted by Patty, who promised that she would finally provide a full account of what actually happened at the party. However, when Vicky attempted to call Patty back in order to arrange a face-to-face meeting, she discovered that Patty's phone number had been disconnected, and as far as I know, Vicky has never been able to make contact with her again. Sadly, a number of Leroy's immediate family members have since passed away, including his father Henry, mother Frida, and younger brother John, but Vicky has never stopped seeking answers. But after 56 years, there's still no conclusive answers about Leroy's death. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So as you probably know, I've released a number of episodes about cases from Unsolved Mysteries in which a victim's death was ruled to be a suicide or an accident, but their loved ones were convinced that they were murdered. I've come to believe that in a number of these cases, the original ruling was probably correct and the victims' families were just in denial, but I certainly do not think that the so-called auto-suicide of Leroy Drieth falls into this category. And even if by chance, Leroy really did kill himself by intentionally crashing his car into a tree, the investigation into his death was so jaw-droppingly lazy that his family had every right to demand that the case be reopened. Unfortunately, there isn't all that much information out there about this story, and if you search on newspapers.com, the only media coverage you'll find about Leroy's death from 1968 is one lone press release which reported that it was a suicide. When Vicky Marling pushed for Leroy's exhumation and managed to get a new investigation launched during the 1990s, this case finally started getting some attention, and Vicky also wanted to take steps to ensure that this sort of thing wouldn't keep happening. In 1995, Vicky testified in front of the Colorado House of Representatives in hopes of getting a new amendment passed which would require every county in the state to have their own qualified coroner. At the time, there were no medical prerequisites for that job, as state law stipulated that the only qualifications a candidate needed to become a coroner was to be a registered voter and to have lived in their county for at least 1 year. It was estimated that around 26% of the coroners in Colorado held down such jobs as doctors, dentists, and pharmacists, so they had no special training, and the responsibilities in the position of coroner were probably not their top priority. Vicky's amendment ultimately never passed, but given what happened in Leroy's case, you can understand why she was so passionate about this. So to recap, even though Leroy's car crash took place in Weld County, he was pronounced dead after being taken to a hospital in Boulder County, which is why the Boulder County Deputy Coroner, George Howe Jr., signed his death certificate. The extent of Howe's so-called investigation was speaking with Delbert Mickelson, the ambulance driver that had picked up Leroy, who claimed that a witness at the crash scene told him that Leroy had gotten into a fight with his girlfriend and exclaimed he was going to kill himself before he drove off in his car. And when Howe heard this information, he pretty much said, "Well, that's good enough for me," and ruled Leroy's death to be an auto-suicide without interviewing any witnesses or performing an autopsy. None of the sources I've seen have ever revealed who exactly told Mickelson that Leroy said he was going to kill himself, but if it was someone who was personally involved in Leroy's death, then they obviously would have had their reasons for passing a false narrative. I also find it troubling that Howe wrote in his original report that Leroy's carotid arteries were severed during the crash, even though it turned out they hadn't, which makes me wonder if he even looked at Leroy's body or just filled out his report based solely on third-hand information which was shared with him. To provide some additional context, George Howe Jr. also worked as a mortician and managed his family-owned business, Howe Mortuary. The Howes also seemed to have a generational grip on the position of Boulder County Coroner, as the job was held by at least one member of that family from 1918 until 1986. So when George Howe Jr. was serving as Deputy County Coroner, the County Coroner was his own brother. Hell, when Vicky launched her own investigation decades later, she even spoke to George Jr.'s son, Jeff Howe, who continued to maintain that his father's auto-suicide ruling for Leroy was the correct one. For all we know, perhaps George Jr. did do a decent job at managing his family's mortuary, but if that was his top priority, then I can see why he didn't put his heart and soul into properly investigating suspicious deaths. In other words, if your business is preparing dead bodies for burial, does it really matter how they died? Anyway, the main reason that Leroy's cause of death was changed from suicide to undetermined is because the autopsy performed by Dr. Patrick Allen over 25 years later revealed a stab wound and a slash wound on his neck to indicate that he was violently attacked before he crashed his car. What complicates this situation is that Dr. Allen still believed that Leroy was technically killed by the injuries he sustained during the car crash, but if Leon was stabbed and had his throat slashed and was fleeing for his life when he crashed, then someone else was culpable for his death, as it's possible he still would have succumbed to his injuries no matter what. While I'm sure it might be difficult trying to find out what specific charges to file against a third party for their culpability in this, it was still a major victory for Leroy's family to not have his death listed as a suicide. So, like I mentioned earlier, there is only a limited amount of information available about this case, but I would certainly love to learn more details about Leroy's relationship with his former fiancée, Patty, in order to get a better sense of what happened here. The couple first got together when Leroy was 17 and Patty was 16, and within a year they were engaged to be married, though Leroy died before this could happen. Vicky spoke to a number of people who said that there was some sort of altercation at the party which was held at Patty's residence, and I'm guessing it must have been pretty memorable if these witnesses were still able to recall it over 2 decades after the fact. It sounds like no one, not even Patty, was able to corroborate that Leroy openly said he was going to kill himself before he drove away, but there were lots of people who recalled Leroy getting into an argument with members of Patty's family, supposedly over the fact that Leroy was white and Patty was Hispanic. Even though Leroy and Patty had been together for a year at this point, perhaps the fact that they were now engaged, combined with people drinking at this party, caused some simmering tensions about this interracial relationship to rise to the surface. When this case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, the only individual who was willing to go on camera and provide a first-hand account of that party was Carolyn Wirtz, who was married to one of Patty's brothers at that time. While I don't know anything about Carolyn's personal life, I get the impression they were no longer married by the time she gave this interview. But what I find particularly interesting is that Carolyn was also white, so she may have had some personal knowledge about that family having issues with interracial marriage. However, even though Carolyn did apparently see a confrontation at that party, it does not sound like she or any of the other witnesses Vicky spoke to personally witnessed Leroy get violently attacked, so this is based on nothing more than Vicky's own personal theory. The theory which Vicky has always pushed forward is that while Leroy was walking out to his car and preparing to leave the party, one of Patty's family members snuck up from behind in order to stab his neck and slash his throat. In spite of this, Leroy still managed to climb into his car and speed away, but he crashed into the tree a short time later. Whenever someone pushes forward a conspiracy about a victim being killed at a party or a social gathering and multiple people working together to cover the whole thing up, I become skeptical, as it's hard to imagine everyone being able to keep their mouth shut for a prolonged period of time. But if Leroy was attacked outside the house and took off immediately thereafter, then it's possible that no one else actually witnessed anything. For all we know, perhaps the attacker was the one who fed the false narrative to Delbert Mickelson about Leroy getting into a fight with Patty and saying he was going to kill himself, which the other people from that party may have believed. If Patty was escorting Leroy to his car at the time he was attacked, then she may have been the only direct witness to this incident. We know that Patty spoke to Vicky and was willing to debunk the rumor that Leroy said he would kill himself, but she would not say anything further. You definitely get the sense that Patty wanted to get something off her chest, but the issue is that if Leroy was the victim of foul play, then the likely perpetrator was someone from her own family. After the Unsolved Mysteries episode aired, Patty got in touch with Vicky and told her she was willing to share the entire story until she suddenly broke off all contact. So it sounds like she was having a crisis of conscience. It would be one thing if Leroy was attacked in front of multiple eyewitnesses at this party, but if the only people who knew the full truth are a member of the perpetrator's own family, then you can understand their willingness to remain silent for so many years. Like I mentioned earlier, the family's surname has never been released publicly, so I have no way of checking what Patty or any of her relatives are up to today, and I'm not even sure how many people who attended that party might still be alive. I do think that Vicky's theory about Leroy being attacked before he sped off and crashed into the tree is very believable, but since there was not a proper investigation for over 2 decades, that makes this case all the more difficult to solve, particularly if those who have knowledge about what happened continue to keep their mouths shut. But if by chance you happen to have any information about the death of Leroy Drieth, please contact the Weld County Sheriff's Office at 970-356-4015. That's 970-356-4015. So now let's move on to our second case. Our second story begins in 1992 in Fauquier County, Virginia, and our second victim is 37-year-old Joan Rochelle Malone, who goes by the name Shelly. Originally born in Annapolis, Maryland, Shelly spent most of her childhood growing up in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, before she relocated to Fauquier County in 1988. At this particular point, Shelly resides in a rented house on a piece of property known as Western View Farm, and it is located outside a small incorporated town called The Plains, which has a population of just over 200 and consists mostly of wealthy, affluent residents. Shelly owns a gift shop in the nearby town of Middleburg, and as a major horseback riding enthusiast, she houses 2 horses in her stable named Impressive Tim and 10 Bar, and often competes in dressage events. Shelly has 2 failed marriages under her belt, but for the past 2 years, she has been involved in a relationship with a man named George Carhart, who lives in New York, but often travels to Fauquier County to visit her. On Sunday, October the 18th, Shelly was being visited at a residence by George, her friend Erica Stumvoll, and Erica's boyfriend Carter Wiley. During the late afternoon, Shelly and Erica decided to go on a sunset horseback ride together on the property while the two men remained behind at the house. Shelly would ride on Impressive Tim, while Erica rode on another horse Shelly had borrowed named Cornpone. However, about an hour after they left, Erica would suddenly show up at the residence of one of Shelly's neighbors in order to seek help because there had been a terrible accident. When Erica called 911, she informed them that she and Shelly had been riding together on several trails and through several fields on Shelly's property. At around 5:30 p.m., they were traveling side by side through an unplowed field in a wooded area when their two horses suddenly got spooked by something. Erica was thrown to the ground by Cornpone, but was not seriously injured. But when she looked 30 yards into the distance, she saw that Shelly had also been thrown to the ground by Impressive Tim, and the horse proceeded to stomp on Shelly's chest and kick her in the head. Erica said that Shelly began to sit up on her hands and knees while gasping for air, but then collapsed to the ground again and drifted in and out of consciousness. Erica attempted to check Shelly's pulse and discovered that her left cheek was turning purplish blue from a facial injury, so she covered Shelly with her jacket and left the scene in order to get help. By the time Erica was able to lead paramedics back to the scene, Shelly was still lying on the ground with serious injuries to her body, and she was no longer breathing. The paramedics attempted to perform CPR on Shelly until a rescue helicopter arrived in order to transport Shelly to the Washington Hospital Center in Washington, D.C. But by then, it was too late, and Shelly was pronounced dead upon arrival. Since Shelly had the large imprint of a horseshoe on her chest, this seemed to support Erica's story, as the force of the blow she received had been strong enough to completely rupture her heart. In fact, when Shelly's death certificate was issued, her cause of death was listed as quote-unquote hemopericardium due to laceration of the heart due to blunt force trauma to the chest. Later that evening, George Carhart called Shelly's mother, Frances Shewan, in Fort Lauderdale to inform her about what happened, and Frances would soon travel to Virginia alongside her two sons, Jeff and Joe Malone. However, it wasn't long before Shelly's family noticed a number of suspicious discrepancies, which made them think her death may not have been an accident. When they went to view Shelly's body at a morgue in Washington, D.C., and were shown photographs of Shelly's face, they were surprised by how swollen it was, as her eyes were completely black and blue. They felt it was more likely that these injuries would have been caused by her being physically assaulted by a human rather than being kicked by a horse. Since Shelly was a very experienced horseback rider who had owned Impressive Tim for years and had a very close relationship with him, her family had a hard time believing that anything could have made the horse act with such hostility that it stomped Shelly to death. Frances and her sons also noticed a number of warning signs which made them suspect that George Carhart, Erica Stumvoll, and Carter Wiley might be covering something up. For starters, when Frances first met Carter, his mother, and his stepmother, they told her that they were speaking with Senator John Warner, another prominent resident from the Plains, to see if he could arrange for the authorities to bypass Shelly's autopsy. The Wileys said that this was only being done because there was a backlog at the morgue in Washington, D.C., as there were apparently 22 other deceased individuals ahead of Shelly who were awaiting their own autopsies. But this made Frances wonder if there were ulterior motives for them not wanting an autopsy to be performed. Frances also found it troubling that the paramedics didn't arrive at the scene to assist Shelly until 6:52 p.m., nearly an hour and a half after Erica said the accident occurred. According to Erica, when she left to get help, she could not figure out the way back to Western View Farm, even though it was located less than a mile away, so she kept getting lost. Erica eventually wound up at a neighbor's house, but her first phone call was actually made to Carter's stepmother, who advised her to call 911. The house's owner made the 911 call at 6:18 p.m., but it would be over half an hour before paramedics were able to tend to Shelly because it had started to get dark, and Erica still had a difficult time figuring out the correct route to lead them back to the field where Shelly's body was. Frances was particularly suspicious of George Carhart, as shortly before her death, Shelly had told her mother that she was ready to move on from George, as she said that he was non-committal and the relationship was beginning to become strained. A former boyfriend of Shelly's named Stephen Head would later say that Shelly had started sleeping with him again and said she was planning to end her relationship with George, so Stephen was hoping to propose to her by the end of the year. If that wasn't enough, in the days following Shelly's death, a letter arrived at her residence which had been written by a local attorney named Robin Gullock, who handled some of Shelly's legal affairs. Robin mentioned having a romantic encounter with Shelly on Friday, October the 16th, 2 days before she died, so Frances began to wonder if George might have found out about the affair and was driven to commit murder. Shortly after Frances and her 2 sons arrived at Western View Farm, Jeff Malone asked George to direct him towards the location where Shelly died. George wound up sending Jeff in the wrong direction, and when Jeff returned to the residence, George admitted that he had intentionally sent him off on a wild goose chase as a joke. George then proceeded to point Jeff towards a different location, but this once again turned out to be the wrong direction. The family could not figure out whether George was just being extremely insensitive or if he was intentionally trying to prevent them from visiting the spot where Shelly was killed. 2 days after Shelly's funeral, the family's suspicions about George increased when Frances, Jeff, and Joe all arrived at Western View Farm and discovered that George had enlisted the help of a number of other people to move Shelly's personal belongings out of the house. Pieces of Shelly's furniture were in the bed of George's pickup truck. Some of her personal items were put into storage at a nearby farm belonging to the Wiley family, while others were placed in garbage bags for disposal. When Frances confronted George and asked why he was doing this without their knowledge or consent, he told them that he wanted to get rid of anything which had belonged to Shelly, quote-unquote, pre-George. A number of Shelly's most treasured possessions, including her diary, were never seen again, and George said that most of Shelly's clothing would be sent to charity. The bloody clothing Shelly was wearing on the day of her death had been brought home from the hospital, but George told the family he had thrown it out. The following day, Jeff and Joe decided to travel to the dump where George had disposed of Shelly's personal items in order to search for her bloody clothing, but while they were unable to find it, they did find some trash bags containing about 24 empty boxes from the jewelry merchants Tiffany & Company and Cartier. Shelly bought most of her jewelry from these merchants, but none of it could be found after her death. When George was asked where the jewelry was, he claimed that Shelly had hawked it due to the fact that she was suffering from financial problems, which caused her gift shop in Middleburg to shut down. While this only served to further convince Shelly's family that her so-called horseback riding accident was staged, and that George, Erica, and Carter may have all been complicit in her death. The morning after Shelly was killed, a witness said they saw her horse, Impressive Tim, and he appeared to be heavily lathered, which meant he had developed a foamy sweat on his body to suggest a lot of physical exertion. Impressive Tim was also wearing a bit which appeared to be bent, and the bit wound up disappearing. Rather than keep Impressive Tim inside Shelly's stable, the Wiley family decided to send the horse to a private stable, even though they would be charged a boarding fee. As a result, Shelly's family was unable to see the horse for weeks, and when Impressive Tim was finally returned to Western View Farm, one of his shoes was missing. Since the Fauquier County Sheriff's Office believed that Shelly's death was nothing more than an accident, George and Carter were never formally interviewed, and the only official account of the accident was a single written statement provided by Erica 5 weeks after the fact. When Shelly's truck, a Toyota 4Runner, was returned to her family, Jeff Malone agreed to drive it down to Florida. However, shortly after he arrived, Jeff noticed what appeared to be small traces of blood on the truck's ceiling, as well as on the front passenger seat and in the far rear carpeting. Since Frances worked as an aide at the Wilton Manors Police Department, she was able to convince one of their detectives to perform some forensic testing on the truck. The detective determined that the blood was likely human and may have been caused by a head wound which created blood spatter. This made Shelly's family suspect that she was not actually killed in the field where she was found, as the truck may have been used to transport her body to that location. The truck was subsequently returned to Fauquier County so that additional forensic testing could be performed by the sheriff's office, but they did not believe the minute presence of blood was conclusive evidence that foul play had taken place. Shelly's family provided a sample of her blood, which had been taken following her death, in hopes that a DNA comparison could be made to the blood in the truck, but the sheriff's office said they were unable to do this because of restrictions on their budget. Nonetheless, the Virginia State Police and the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in Washington, D.C. would agree to take a fresh look at the case, but they both concurred with the original ruling that Shelly's death was an accident. This story would be featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, which aired in May of 1996, but the Fauquier County Sheriff's Office declined to participate in the broadcast, and George, Erica, and Carter all turned down the show's requests for interviews. 2 years after the episode aired, forensic pathologist Jonathan Arden was appointed to be the new chief medical examiner for the government of the District of Columbia, and he agreed to take a fresh look at the case. Shelly's body was exhumed in October of 1988, but after Arden performed a new autopsy, he ultimately concurred that her death was an accident. Arden said there were no signs of struggle or other wounds on Shelly's body to suggest she had been the victim of foul play, and there was also no evidence to indicate she had been drugged. He stated, quote, "Nothing that I found caused me to believe there was major or significant error that needed to be rectified," end quote. In spite of this, Shelly's family continued to believe that she was murdered, and her death remained shrouded in mystery. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So I think it's safe to say that this is the first case featured on this podcast about a victim who was supposedly trampled to death by a horse, but their loved ones insisted that they were murdered. Of course, that's not to say that staging a fake horseback riding accident to kill someone is unprecedented. As many of you probably know, the very first segment featured on the very first Robert Stack-hosted episode of Unsolved Mysteries was the murder of Shannon Moore by her husband, Dave Davis, who injected her with a lethal tranquilizer while they were out horseback riding, and then smashed her head on a rock to make her death look like an accident so that he could cash in on a substantial life insurance policy. In that case, the victim's death was reclassified as a homicide and ultimately resulted in the arrest and conviction of the perpetrator, but the key difference here is that there were no traces of drugs in Shelly Malone's system, and her death was caused by blunt force trauma so severe that it wound up rupturing her heart. She also had a large imprint of a horseshoe on her chest, and while you may be wondering how something like that could be staged, the two theories which have been pushed forward by Shelly's family is that her killer either somehow forced her horse, Impressive Tim, to stomp on her, or they attached a horseshoe to a 2x4 and then drove it down into her chest to make it look like a horse stomped on her. Well, it's difficult enough for me to believe that anyone could make a horse step on a rider who had spent years loving and caring for them, but the second theory sounds particularly far-fetched. I have to think it would be very difficult for even the strongest human to replicate a blow like this so effectively that they managed to fool multiple medical examiners into believing it was caused by a horse. But on the other hand, the official story about how Shelly was supposedly killed by Impressive Tim does seem pretty unusual as well. The Unsolved Mystery segment featured an interview with a horse expert named John Strasburger, who had been the editor of the equestrian magazine, The Chronicle of the Horse, and he said he had a hard time imagining that a trained thoroughbred would just throw their rider to the ground and then proceed to trample over them, accidentally or otherwise, in an open field. And when browsing through online discussions about this case, I've seen a number of people who say they have experience riding horses comment on how out of the ordinary this situation is. I also have to acknowledge that some of the behavior by the three people alleged to be involved in Shelly's death does come across as suspicious, but is this simply the result of them being not so nice people rather than murderers? Aside from the Unsolved Mystery segment, the only other media sources I've seen for this case are an article from the July 1993 edition of Washingtonian magazine written by Howard Means, and an article written by Peter Slevin titled The Horse Whisperers, which was published in the Washington Post on May 2, 1999. But both these articles are pretty extensive and offer a lot of fascinating information about Shelly's background, even though most of it probably holds no relevance towards her death. Until I read these articles, I had no idea that Shelly had been married twice, and her second husband, Pablo Aguirre La Rosa, actually lived with her in Virginia for a while. The couple had originally met while Shelly was in France, and it seems like they only got married so that Pablo could get a green card and move to America. When things didn't work out, Pablo returned to Europe in 1989, but the couple never officially divorced, so even though Shelly was in a relationship with another man, she was technically still legally married at the time of her death. The Unsolved Mysteries segment contained quite a few throwaway lines about Shelly's background, such as the fact that she had been convicted on drug charges in 1979. What they don't mention is that Shelly's first husband, David Bergnon, was involved in the cocaine trade, and the couple was arrested during a major drug bust at their residence in Louisville, Kentucky. Shelly's parents had a very unhappy marriage, and they divorced when she was still in her teens, so she wound up leaving home and marrying David when she was only 17 years old. In fact, rumor has it that Shelly's father offered the couple money to get married so he could free himself from child support payments to Shelly. Even though David would do prison time on the drug charges, Shelly only received a sentence of 5 years probation, but sometime later, she would become embroiled in a savings and loan scandal, which was only briefly mentioned in passing on Unsolved Mysteries. The 1980s had no shortage of these sorts of scandals, and this one involved a Texas-based institution called the Vernon Savings and Loan Association, whose owner, Donald Ray Dixon, wound up being convicted on 23 counts of fraud and racketeering. Dixon pretty much used the company as his own personal piggy bank, and when they closed down, they cost the government a bailout of $1.3 billion. Well, before all this went down, Shelly became acquainted with Dixon when she was hired to be the manager of his luxury yacht, and the story goes that Dixon once sent Shelly and a female friend to see the Texas Savings and Loan Commissioner on what he classified as a quote-unquote goodwill entertainment trip. Shelly was even called upon to testify in front of a grand jury over this whole situation, but denied that anything inappropriate occurred on this trip. If you're wondering how Shelly wound up residing in an affluent community like the Plains, Virginia, the Unsolved Mysteries segment briefly mentioned that she developed a close relationship with a wealthy international investor/benefactor named Cecil Altman, who originally hailed from Switzerland and helped Shelly open her own gift shop in Middelburg. Altman would frequently sponsor first-class trips to Europe for Shelly and provide her with a $5,000 monthly allowance, as well as lines of credit in his name if she wound up exhausting her allowance. Altman was considerably older than Shelly and was also married and had grown children, but even though he was described as a genuinely nice man who wanted to be a mentor towards Shelly, the aforementioned Washington Post article stated that he, quote-unquote, enjoyed her occasional attentions in return. Again, none of these details about Shelly's background seem to have much relevance to her death, but it does paint a clearer picture of her as a person and might offer some insight into why her family became so adamant that she was the victim of foul play. Shelly originally hailed from a modest middle-class background, so when her mother and two brothers traveled to the Plains following her death, they were pretty much entering an entirely different world, and there seemed to be a major culture clash. For instance, when they first arrived at Western View Farm, Shelly's friends and a number of the other local residents were hanging out there, drinking cocktails, smoking cigarettes, and listening to music, and it almost seemed like they were throwing some sort of party. Her family was left pretty aghast by the whole situation, and while it may have given off the impression that no one cared about Shelly's death, it sounds like this was just the area's own way of reacting to tragedy. For their part, some of the residents from the Plains spoke to the media and did not have very nice things to say about Shelly's family, alleging that they grossly misinterpreted a number of their actions and were falsely accusing innocent people of a non-existent murder. Indeed, Shelly's family seemed convinced that since the Plains was such an affluent community, local law enforcement was orchestrating a cover-up to protect the perpetrators. At one point, they wrote a letter to Virginia Governor Douglas Wilder, accusing Fauquier County Sheriff Joseph Higgs Jr. of botching the investigation and referring to him as a quote-unquote rogue sheriff. They also staged public vigils and orchestrated protests and published full-page advertisements in the Fauquier Citizen newspaper in which they attacked Sheriff Higgs. In total, it's estimated that they spent over $40,000 on their campaign to seek justice for Shelly. For his part, Higgs told the press, quote, "We have proven unequivocally that there has been no wrongdoing. We spent, 600 to 700 hours on this case, going back through every piece of evidence, every statement, every interview. I mean, I committed more time to this closed case than I have ever done in my career in law enforcement." End quote. Now, when Robert Stack introduced the Unsolved Mystery segment, he mentioned that George Carhart, Erica Stumvoll, and Carter Wiley, as well as the local authorities, had all declined the show's requests for interviews, so he acknowledged that the story would be told almost entirely from the point of view of Shelly's family. One individual that was interviewed in this segment was Shelly's first cousin, Tom Hardy, a literature professor who pretty much evolved into her #1 advocate. In fact, Tom was the one who pushed forward the theory that Shelly's killers attached a horseshoe to a 2x4 and used it to create the hoof imprint in her chest. He also makes a rather ludicrous statement during his interview that he talked to medical people who told him that a man with a big fist could strike a smaller statured woman like Shelly so hard that they could sever the ventricle of her heart with the force of their hand. When the Horse Whisperers article was published in the Washington Post in 1999, Tom was pretty much the focal point, and he acknowledged that his attempts to seek justice for Shelly had completely consumed his life and prompted him to give up on an art history doctorate he was working on. Quite frankly, Tom does come across as rather obsessive, and you get the sense that nothing is ever going to change his mind about Shelly's death being a homicide. It was Tom who pushed for Shelly's body to be exhumed for a new autopsy in 1998, even though her mother Frances was reluctant to do this, and had pretty much reached the point where she decided the whole thing was a lost cause and was ready to move on with her life. However, Shelly's brothers agreed to the exhumation, and even after the new chief medical examiner for the government of the District of Columbia, Jonathan Arden, performed an autopsy and concurred with the conclusion that Shelly's death was accidental and there was no evidence of foul play, Tom still refused to accept it. This was over 25 years ago, and I have not seen any coverage about Shelly's story in the media since then, so I do wonder if perhaps her family has finally decided to move on and accepted that her death was likely an accident. I can understand the frustration from Shelly's family over the Fauquier County Sheriff's Office investigation, because even if this really was an accident, they should have interviewed George and Carter. And it is pretty ridiculous that they did not take an official statement from Erica until 5 weeks after the fact, because if she was guilty of something, that would have given her plenty of time to fabricate a cover story. But when the new chief medical examiner agrees to take a fresh look at the case and perform a new autopsy at the request of the family, and still reaches the conclusion that there was no foul play, I think you do have to accept the possibility that the original conclusion was correct. I mean, Jonathan Arden is a pretty prominent figure in the world of forensic pathology, as he went on to work on some high-profile cases, such as the 2001 murder of Sean Relevy. I don't see George, Erica, and Carter being such sophisticated criminal masterminds that they managed to fool someone like that into believing that a murder was a horseback riding accident. And as the newly appointed chief medical examiner for the government of the District of Columbia, why would Arden want to intentionally cover up a crime which took place in Fauquier County? But for the sake of argument, let's explore the possibility that Shelly's death could have been a homicide. The two potential motives which have been pushed forward is that George wanted to get his hands on Shelly's valuables, such as her jewelry, or became enraged because Shelly wanted to end their 2-year relationship. I can definitely understand why Shelly's family would become suspicious of George, as it does not sound like he was the nicest, most sensitive guy in the world. Before Shelly was killed, Frances had been planning to go on vacation and spend some time traveling around Virginia with her daughter, but when George phoned Frances to inform her about what happened to Shelly, the first thing he said was, quote, "It looks like you won't be taking that vacation after all. Shelly has a problem," end quote. Frances said she was expecting to hear that Shelly had been injured or something, but was completely taken aback when George told her she was dead. And when Jeff Malone arrived in Virginia and asked George to point him towards the spot where Shelly died, George intentionally sent him in the wrong direction no less than 2 times and acted like it was all just some sort of practical joke. I mean, I can understand why Jeff would have become suspicious and believed that George was trying to prevent him from exploring a potential murder scene. Of course, the biggest red flag was when George went to the trouble of removing all of Shelly's personal belongings from her house only 2 days after her funeral without the consent and participation of her family. They later found a garbage bag at the dump containing a bunch of empty jewelry boxes, and even though George tried to say that Shelly had pawned off all her jewelry, I really don't buy that explanation, because why would she feel the need to hold on to all these empty boxes? If someone did buy jewelry from Shelly, it's logical to assume that they would have wanted the box that went with it, since they contained certificates of authenticity from the jewelers. So yeah, I am willing to believe that George may have been an incredibly greedy opportunist and pocketed all that jewelry for himself, but while that's certainly unethical, does that necessarily prove he's a murderer? I know that the bloody clothing that Shelly was wearing on the day of her death also went missing and was never found, but I could also see her friends throwing the clothing out, even if they were completely innocent. If her death was ruled to be an accident and there was no criminal investigation, then why would they feel the need to hold on to the clothing? Shelly's diary also disappeared, and while this could be construed as George wanting to get rid of it because it contained incriminating information about him, he may have simply thought that there was no reason to hold on to the diary and was self-absorbed enough to not consider the possibility that Shelly's family might have wanted it. A lot of emphasis has been put on the fact that Shelly had a romantic encounter with a man named Robin Gullock 2 days before her death, which may have driven George to kill her. However, the only reason we know about this is because Robin mentioned the affair in a letter he sent out to Shelly, which did not arrive until after she was dead. So we have no idea if George actually found out about the affair beforehand. It really does sound like Shelly and George's relationship was on its last legs, and she was planning to end it soon, but even if this gave him a potential motive for murder, would he really have been able to convince Erica and Carter to go along with it and help him cover the whole thing up? It's worth noting that Erica and Carter eventually got married and had children, and as far as I can tell, they are still together today, and I see no red flags to indicate that they are the type of people who would have been involved in a criminal conspiracy. The official story is that Erica was the one who was with Shelly when she was stomped by her horse, while George and Carter were back at the house. I think the Unsolved Mystery segment was a bit misleading when it said that Erica got lost when she attempted to go for help, and it took an hour and a half for paramedics to make it to the scene. They do not mention that when Erica couldn't find her way back to Western View Farm, she went to a neighbor's residence to call 911, and when paramedics arrived, it took her a while to lead them back to the field where Shelly was, since she didn't know her way around. I mean, it sounds like this was a pretty large property with a number of fields and wooded areas, and it's not like Erica lived there, so I don't find it all that unbelievable that she could have gotten lost, particularly since it was getting dark and she was likely in panic mode and not thinking clearly. If that was a murder staged to look like an accident, then it seems needlessly elaborate for Erica to go to a neighbor's house and pretend to get lost while leading the paramedics back towards Shelly. It's also worth mentioning that George and Carter were with Erica and the paramedics when they were trying to find their way around, so it's not like Erica would have been stalling or doing anything to buy more time for the two men to stage Shelly's accident. As we're going to talk about momentarily, the scenario pushed forward by Shelly's family is that she was killed at another location, and the responsible parties used her Toyota 4Runner to move her body to the field where she was found. But if this is what happened, why not immediately return to Shelly's house and call 911? Why go through the charade of Erica pretending to get lost and going to a neighbor to call for help? If this entire horseback riding accident was staged, it has to be one of the most clever and successful murder plots ever carried out, but I'm not sure if these 3 otherwise law-abiding citizens would be capable of something like this and be able to remain silent about it for over 30 years. All that being said, small traces of blood were found inside Shelly's truck, which have never been adequately explained, so I can see why her family subscribed to the theory that it was used to transport her body and that she may have been murdered inside there. When George and Carter learned about what happened and followed the paramedics to the field to find Shelly's body, they used her Toyota 4Runner to drive there, so obviously, finding the truck's tire tracks at the scene would not prove or disprove her family's theory. There seems to be different interpretations from different law enforcement agencies about the significance of this blood, because when Shelly's family convinced the Wilton Manors Police Department to perform a forensic examination of the truck, they thought there were traces of blood spatter on the ceiling to indicate that someone had received a head wound from the front passenger seat. However, after the Fauquier County Sheriff's Office performed their own forensic examination, they sent the truck to the Virginia State Crime Lab, who determined that there was only a small trace of blood on the passenger seat. By his own admission, Jeff Malone actually suffered a nosebleed while he was in the midst of driving the truck from Virginia to Florida, and he used a cash register receipt to stop it. So this could have been a potential source for at least some, if not all, of the blood. The sheriff's office said that they did not have the budget to perform DNA testing to determine if the blood belonged to Shelly, but this was back during the mid-1990s when DNA profiling was still in its infancy in criminal investigations. If this blood evidence was still around today, I'm sure that more advanced DNA testing could conclusively determine if it belonged to Shelly, but since the amount of blood was so small, would this really prove that foul play took place? After all, this was Shelly's own truck, so the blood could have been the result of something minor, such as her cutting herself or experiencing a nosebleed. I once again have to harken back to the fact that multiple medical examiners have performed autopsies on Shelly's body and have remained convinced that her death was accidental. You can remain suspicious of some of the actions from George, Erica, and Carter, but that doesn't change the fact that Shelly received such a strong blow to the chest that it ruptured her heart, and a horseshoe imprint was found there. Yes, it does seem out of the ordinary that a seemingly well-trained thoroughbred like Impressive Tim would do something like that to a person, but it could have been a sudden, spur-of-the-moment thing where Shelly just happened to be in the horse's way when he was flailing his feet, and he accidentally wound up stomping her chest and kicking her in the face. That still comes across as more believable than someone forcing Impressive Tim to do this, or attaching a horseshoe to a 2x4 and striking Shelly to create that wound. As far as I know, I cannot find any other documented cases where someone staged a murder like this in order to make it look like an accident. Don't get me wrong, if it turned out that George, Erica, and Carter were not telling the full truth about what actually happened, I would not be the least bit surprised, as it's possible that Shelly really was thrown from her horse and trampled, but the events did not play out exactly like they said they did. But unlike the Leroy Drieth case, I do think that accident is the most logical explanation here, though this is admittedly a very bizarre case. All that being said, if you happen to have any information about the death of Shelly Malone, which does point to it being foul play, please contact the Fauquier County Sheriff's Office at 540-347-3300. That's 540-347-3300. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now, the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 6 years, our Patreon page has released nearly 70 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in our archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode about the disappearance of Dee Dee Rosenthal, who was the apparent victim of a murder, but even after her supposed killer confessed, her remains were never found. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my two co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, cover a very odd missing persons case, the 1998 disappearance of 98-year-old Walter Dunson. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 60 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are S, L Rock Mix, Julia M, and Andrew M. Thank you all so much for your support. I just wanted to remind everyone that The Trail Went Cold will be returning to the True Crime Podcast Festival, which is being held at the Denver Marriott Westminster in Colorado from July the 12th to the 14th. If you would like to purchase tickets, we have a discount code for 15% off, so please visit truecrimepodcastfestival.com and enter the promo code TRAIL. Once again, that's truecrimepodcastfestival.com, and the promo code is TRAIL for 15% off tickets. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.